Hey everybody, today I'm doing some easy stuff and some hard stuff, and sometimes the easy stuff ends up being the hard stuff, and the hard stuff is actually the easy stuff. So let's see which is which. Not to start off on a completely random tangent, but tangents are fun, so to start off on a completely random tangent, do you remember those old Choose Your Own Adventure books? I imagine they're still a thing, but back when I was a kid, we had these books where at different points in the story you could make a choice, then jump to a different part of the book and see what the repercussions of that choice had for the storyline. And I've always wondered what could make woodworking YouTube videos more fun and interesting to watch. And I think Choose Your Own Adventure might just be the answer. I'm still kind of working on the concept and I need to get in touch with someone at YouTube, but I think I might be onto something. It would kind of be like this. If you're building this cabinet, what would be the first thing you would do? Put the viewer in the driver's seat, or I guess the wood shop in this case. Good choice. Playing it safe, start off with something a little straightforward. Well, part of the fun of choosing your own adventure is that you never really know which way a choice will take you. So here's a twist. This cabinet isn't actually that straightforward. Because I wanted to incorporate tambour doors, which are basically sliding doors, but we'll get more into that later, these doors pose some design challenges that needed some forethought. And this being the first time I'm doing a true tambour door, I really had to think about what I was doing. The main challenges were figuring out where the grooves or track for the doors would go, as well as where I'd need vertical dividers. With a sliding tambour door, which is basically a bunch of slats that run on a track and can be pushed around a curve, there's kind of a sweet spot of the track size, the radius of the corners, and the size of the slats in the door, all of which determine how well the door slides and how it looks. I did a little bit of testing and I knew my doors were going to be pretty long and fairly heavy, so I needed to be sure they could be pushed around those corners. But I also wanted the corners to be as sharp as possible to maintain the look of a flat door on the front of the cabinet. So with enough testing to make me feel confident that everything would work out, I could get to work. And by that, I mean get to work standing and watching my CNC get to work and cut the grooves, because a CNC cuts everything perfectly. I didn't get it on camera, but I swear I mess up more using a CNC machine than just about any other tool in my shop. But luckily, as the old saying goes, there are two sides to every piece of plywood. So we soldiered on. Making this cabinet was an interesting challenge. As I started to design it, it was one of those situations where each time I thought of an issue, then came up with a solution, that solution would lead to another issue, which needed another solution, and it kind of felt like it was never going to end. I figured out the track layout and how the doors would work, then realized that if I had a moving door within the cabinet, I wouldn't have a solid wall to mount shelves. So I realized I'd need a second set of vertical dividers to essentially block the sliding door on each end. And literally, as I'm writing this, the cabinet is like 90% done at this point, and I'm just kind of realizing that whatever's on the shelves, if it gets pushed too far back in the cabinet, it's going to potentially block the door from sliding around the back. So I guess I'll be figuring that out soon, I hope. Anyway, I guess the point is that a seemingly simple cabinet, and what I originally thought would be the easy part of this build, can quickly snowball into something much more complicated. But this is the adventure we chose after all, so we'll just keep doing what we're doing. Hey, real quick, before we keep going, I wanted to thank Bespoke Post for sponsoring today's video. If you haven't heard of them, Bespoke Post is a monthly membership club that delivers a box of top shelf items from often under the radar brands. And even better is that 90% of the products come from small brands, many of which are based right here in the US. Each month, Bespoke Post introduces their members to new products, which are based on a preference quiz that you can fill out, And the great thing is there's a wide range of products, all of which are high quality. They have great clothes, cool stuff for your house, camping, cooking gear. There's almost certainly something for everyone. And it's free to join, and you can skip a month or cancel at any time. You'll get a customized selection of products picked for you, and the best part is that before it's shipped, you can preview what's inside. Then you can decide if you'd like to keep it, swap things out, or just skip the month entirely for no charge. You only pay for what you want, which is nice. They also now offer a new membership program where you can get great deals all year round. It's free to join, and you can get discounts of 30% or more sometimes. Bespoke Post sent me a few boxes, the concentrate box, the weekender box, and the split box, which ended up being really perfect because I happen to have a little weekend trip planned, and I knew I'd be getting up early, so a little cold brew coffee made in my new cold brew maker with Bolivar bitters served in a concrete cup because why not? Then pack everything up in this weekender bag, including my new field hatchet, because I like to be prepared and you never know when you might need to split some wood. All right, if you're interested in getting some cool stuff each month, and if you want to get a free mystery gift with your first membership purchase, click the link in the description and enter the code SeanGift at checkout, or go to bespokepost.com/SeanGift. All right, thanks Bespoke Post. If you've watched some of my other videos, you'll have seen me make curved pieces in a few different ways. Bent lamination, segmented turning, and this method, which is kind of cheater bent lamination, where I'm using flexible plywood to make a bent lamination just with far fewer layers. Even that could be a choice in the adventure, which type of bending method to use. But actually, now that I'm thinking about this a bit more, I'm kind of making a lot of work for myself, having to make and film all these different options. Okay, I'll make a note of that. Choose your own adventure might be too hard. Anyway, I've actually used this exact bending method before, so it might look a little familiar to some of you. It's basically a couple layers of 5/16 of an inch thick flexible plywood and a single layer of 1/8 inch thick, which gets me pretty close to 3/4 of an inch to match the plywood I'll be using for the cabinet. And in this particular piece, I actually didn't need to match perfectly because the curved end would be attached to a closed end of the cabinet. So nothing really needed to be dead on, which is nice. When making stuff like this, even if I can relax having to be perfectly accurate on one little thing, it just kind of helps take down the overall stress level. I also decided to veneer the curve at this point instead of waiting until after the entire cabinet was assembled. My thought was, and I know this was overly hopeful, but I thought there was a chance I could veneer the curve and get it to match the maple veneered plywood I was using for the rest of the cabinet good enough where I wouldn't have to veneer the entire thing after assembly. It was kind of a gamble that if it paid off, it'd be a big bonus, but if it didn't, I would just kind of end up doing what I was already gonna do. So it really didn't make much of a difference besides having to cut up some veneer at this point that would potentially get covered up down the line. This project had an unexpected theme throughout the build, and I'll say right off the bat, it was not a fun or enjoyable theme. I can't really boil it down to a single word or phrase, but it was basically making mistakes or choices that in the moment seemed like they might completely derail the entire project, but actually ended up being perfectly fine, nothing to worry about in hindsight. The door track mess up on the cabinet was one, and then another happened as I was trying to press the curve in my vacuum bag. When I've done these in the past, I've used something like ratchet straps or packing tape or both to pull the laminations as close against the form as possible before it goes into the bag to limit the chances of anything getting all wonky. Well, this time I thought I didn't have any ratchet straps in my shop, so as I tried to press the curve, the bag was pulling up between the form and the laminations. Which, as you can see, caused understandable frustration. So cameras are always the first thing to turn off when things are getting a little too hectic in my shop, And that's good for building furniture and keeping my head clear, but bad for making YouTube videos. Either way, I pulled everything out and reset and was able to get it back into the bag and pressed onto the form with no issues the second time. And I was using epoxy as my adhesive, so I had plenty of working time and everything ended up being totally fine in the end. It kind of reminds me of, a thunderstorm as a kid. As it's happening, you're scared out of your mind, but then once it's over and it's sunny again, all you can think about is how cool it was. Oh, and by the way, I had ratchet straps sitting under my drum sander the entire time. If you've been keeping up with my most recent videos, you know I've been constantly going on and on about trying new things and continuing to push myself and all of that. So here's my obligatory trying this for the first time, part of the build, and that's these tambour doors. Tambour doors are essentially sliding doors that can slide around curves because they're made up of small slats held together by some sort of flexible backing material. Honestly, I'd never really seen the need to do this style of door, as regular bypass sliding doors usually do the trick, but this design kind of made sense for the piece overall and, try new things. I had a bunch of short pieces of maple left over from my door build last month, which usually would be something that sits around in my shop for way too long, but luckily they were just about the perfect length for these doors, so I got to use it up. Also, does this creep anyone else out? Anyway, I got to work doing the same thing over and over to many pieces of wood. For the most part, in a build, there might be 2 of something, so you repeat yourself once, or maybe you're making some drawer boxes, so you have to do the same thing 6 or 8 times. But with these tambour doors, I think I started with 24 pieces of wood, 12 for each door, and after milling each one, they needed to have a tongue cut onto the top and bottom to fit the groove in the cabinet. So each tongue requires 2 cuts and 2 tongues per board. 4 cuts times 24 boards, it's 96 cuts. From there, I needed to cut everything into 3/4 inch wide strips, and each door consists of 64 strips, so that's at least 128 cuts, maybe more because I did make some extra slats just in case. After that, I wanted a small chamfer on each long front edge of each slat, so that's 2 router passes on each one for a total of 256 chamfers. Then, after doing a bit of testing in the cabinet with some actual slats held together with blue tape, I was a little concerned about how it was sliding because it wasn't sliding that well. So I decided to trim a little bit of the tongue on each side of every slat to hopefully decrease any chances of binding up in the track. So each slat needed 4 small cuts, which would have been another 512, but luckily I wised up a little bit and realized I could cut 2 slats at a time, so I guess it was only another 256 cuts to do this. Now, I'm not trying to show off, but to make these doors, it took almost 750 cuts to get everything to this point, and now I have to cut the fabric for the backing, so go ahead and tack on 4 more. But it's not like making a lot of cuts to make a piece of furniture is a big surprise, but this situation in particular felt a little excessive, especially while I was doing it, but who's counting? And, there's something to be said about doing repetitive tasks. So this piece set a few personal records for me. It has the longest set of tambour doors I've ever made, but I guess that PR is kind of by default. And this is also the biggest bent lamination curve I've made so far. Not by much, but even just a bit bigger, of course, caused me some issues. For the most part, when I make curves like this, I'll joint one edge, then rip the opposite edge on the table saw. Definitely not the easiest couple things to do, but I've had good luck doing it this way in the past. On this one though, I just wasn't able to get the first edge to a point where I felt confident cutting the opposite edge on the table saw. And because the curve was so big, it also ruled out using my bandsaw as well. So I racked my brain and eventually realized I could use the bending form as a router template to trim the edges. Sometimes when I run into a problem, it's easy to get discouraged, but one of the great parts about woodworking is that there's almost always a way to get it done. And it's a great feeling when you're in a situation where you think you're screwed, then you finally have that, what's the word? Like you finally have a moment of insight or realization about something and you finally figure it out. You know, I guess it's similar to when you can't think of a word, then you can finally remember it. It's like a brain relief or something. For the most part, I try not to stick to one specific design style for all the stuff I make, though it is kind of natural to stay in a general design scheme. I suppose I don't stray too far from my usual, but one thing I definitely do is avoid certain design aspects, and typically it's kind of traditional looking design. So one thing I don't do too often in my furniture is make face frames for cabinets. Not that there's anything wrong with face frames, but they do tend to have a more traditional look. Usually a face frame will be attached to the front of a cabinet, then the doors and drawers will overlay that, and everything will look nice and clean. It's a great way to do it. So since I have this aversion to doing something in a traditional way, and if I'm going to be using face frames on this piece, then of course I've got to mix it up a bit, and with this one I almost did the face frame backwards. Oh, and of course, I also have to make it a 1/4 inch too narrow for the cabinet. Another one of those times when, in the moment, I was questioning why I even make furniture, but then I stop and think about it for a second and realize everything can be fixed. So like I said, this face frame is going to be almost backwards to how a face frame is usually used. And in a way, this is just oversized edge banding, but I wanted to be able to do a couple things. First, I wanted the frame to cover up where the tambour doors sat in the grooves of the cabinet. Because the cabinet is made of plywood, I didn't want to easily be able to see in the groove when the doors were open and be able to see those absolutely hideous plies. Sick. I also thought the doors looked cool, kind of sliding behind a window instead of just out in the open. The other thing I wanted was a big roundover on the front edge, and I'd need thick edge banding or a thick face frame to accomplish this. Now, even though I don't use face frames that often, it's still a good skill to have, and I think you could say that about most things. If you want to be good at something, even if it's a creative, artistic something, you have to have the skills. Which is why we're so proud of our online woodworking courses. They really have something to learn for just about anybody, skills you'll use on every project, and some that you might rarely use, but at least you'll have those skills. We truly think our courses are the best ones out there, and we love to see people use them to really push their woodworking skills to the next level. So go check them out if you're interested. I'll put a link in the description. I didn't really set out with this in mind when I first started building this piece, but as it started to come together, I was seeing more and more that the overall look was turning out to be much more organic than a lot of the stuff I usually do. And by shaping this face frame with plenty of smooth transitions paired with the roundovers I'd be adding later, I was starting to see it take shape. A lot of times I lean on contrasting woods and angular shapes, a lot of kind of unnatural looking stuff. But as I started shaping some of these parts and the fact that I was using all the same species of wood, it was starting to look a certain way. And then, especially once I flush trimmed the face frame to the cabinet itself, everything came together and looked like one kind of continuous thing, which I thought looked pretty interesting. And it was pretty much at this moment that I knew that my gamble from earlier, where I thought there was a chance I wouldn't have to veneer the entire cabinet, was quickly becoming a losing bet. I now not only had the seam and color difference between the top of the cabinet and the curve, which is purchased maple veneered plywood right next to the veneer I made, but I also had the seam between the plywood cabinet and the solid wood face frame. So even if all the colors matched up nicely, I had these seams that are gonna be seen no matter what. And as this kind of organic look started to shine through as the piece came together, I knew I should really just kind of lean into it. So, time for another personal record. This time the longest sheet of veneer I've ever made, and maybe one of the more difficult things I've done, at least recently. So I had a 10-foot long board for this piece, and I knew I needed basically the entire length to cover the top of the cabinet and around the curve so that no seam would be visible unless you flip the cabinet upside down. And I don't know why, but I didn't film the initial bandsaw cutting of this veneer. The good thing is it looked very similar to the veneer I cut earlier, just with a much longer piece of wood. I think we can all use our imagination. But I wish I had gotten some footage because it was a serious struggle to make these cuts. I actually ended up cutting these a bit thicker than I usually would, just to give me some extra literal wiggle room to compensate for a potentially bad cut as I was trying to maneuver such a long board through the bandsaw. The next problem I ran into was getting a clean and straight edge on each piece so they could be glued together seamlessly. I racked my brain trying to figure out a good way to use the jointer or my table saw, but the sheer length of these pieces made using either of those tools very difficult. So I came up with this. It was kind of a last-ditch effort, and I wasn't convinced it was going to work that well, but sure enough, as I taped the sheet together, things were starting to look pretty good. Now, the entire time I was getting this sheet of veneer ready, I was thinking about how I'd get the entire thing into the vacuum bag and avoid any issues like I had with the curve. And the entire time, I wasn't even considering that the bag I have wouldn't be big enough. But the bag I have wasn't big enough. So, another first, and I decided to apply the veneer like they've been doing for decades, with some stinky, awful contact cement. I've applied veneer in just about every other way except for this stuff. And I obviously decided to forego any tests or practice on a smaller piece and just figured there's no better way to learn than on a piece of furniture you've already spent way too much time on and needs to be finished within the week. Because YOLO? Do people still say that? Yeah, whatever. And a couple thoughts after applying this veneer with contact cement. It smells as terrible as people say. It wasn't as difficult to use as I thought it might be. It actually worked incredibly well, and my shop didn't burn to the ground because of the fumes like some of the warnings made me think it would. So overall, I'd give it a 8 out of 10. Would use it again, for sure. And on top of that, after trimming and a small round over, the entire piece is almost completely seamless, which was getting me pretty excited to see it all finished. I've said it before, but I've never loved the finishing process, which I know might be a controversial take. People often love adding finish because you really see a piece of furniture kind of come to life. And believe me, I get it. Adding finish can really transform something from to amazing. So on this piece, I really did try to enjoy this part of the build. And if anything, adding finish to this piece really just made me realize I still feel the same way. Maybe even more so. Adding finish to light colored, fairly plain looking wood just doesn't really do it for me. The good thing is that I was already digging this piece, and I'm digging it just as much with finish applied. Also, thoughts on adding this little pop of greenery? This was kind of a last minute addition as I was trying to figure out what should go into this weird little space. But let me know what you think. Love it or hate it. Unfortunately, I feel like there's not really an in-between on something like this, so let me know. Oh, and by the way, the other end of this piece is going to be attached to another piece of furniture, which is why there isn't really much going on down here. You know, I think I've had an epiphany. At the beginning of the video, I was talking about making a choose your own adventure style woodworking YouTube video, which sounds fun and interesting, but I think it's missing the point. And what I think is the point of these videos, and the reason why I've continued to make them over the years, is to entertain, maybe teach a little, learn something myself, but mostly to inspire people. And inspiration can come in many different forms. What I'm building, how I'm building it, maybe some ridiculous tangent I'm talking about. So sure, maybe some weird new format like choose your own adventure would still do that, but I think the fun of these videos comes from being taken on this little journey, then taking that experience and using it as inspiration in your own adventure, whatever it might be, and where you get to choose whatever you want. So for now, I'll choose the adventure for these videos, and you choose the adventure from here. Thanks for watching.